Jacksonian Democracy, Part 2. So, Jackson making himself popular with whites but not with Indians, and he sort of continues to have a troubled career. Then he has the Nullification crisis to deal with. He passes the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, which was meant to protect industries in the North but directly harms the South since they didn't produce goods. John C. Calhoun leads the nullification crisis. Nullification means states attempt to disregard or ignore acts of Congress despite the federal government being declared supreme over the states. At the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, a pamphlet was circulated by Calhoun urging nullification of the Tariff of Abominations. And in fact, South Carolina actually passes an act of nullification within their own state legislature to nullify the tariffs of 1828 and 1832. So the nullification crisis is in effect, and you have the states and the federal government butting heads. The president, Andrew Jackson in this case, decides to use force and actually gets a force bill into Congress to require that South Carolina enforce these laws. The crisis is averted because South Carolina sort of balks first and they back down, but not before it's really painted clearly, especially by John C. Calhoun, that the states and the federal government do not agree on a lot of things, including how to run the economy. So, what is the significance of this crisis? One, the power of the states versus the federal government is still a major issue. The threat of nullification could potentially cause disunion, and in fact, the federal government was prepared to send troops into South Carolina to force them to comply. So you can see the brink of war already. Worry that it would be used with regards to the slavery question, that the federal government would march in to enforce their views on slavery. And Jackson actually loses the support of Southern Democrats at this point, which is kind of a death blow to his presidency. They viewed him as not representing their interest, even though he claimed to be a representative of the common man. Here is an example of the actual language of that nullification bill that was passed in South Carolina. We, therefore, the people of the state of South Carolina, in convention assembled, do declare and ordain that these acts are authorized by the Constitution of the United States and violate the true meaning and intent thereof, and are null, void, and no law nor binding upon this state, its officers or citizens. So there you can see they're literally putting it in language that they're null and void. In 1832, there's another presidential election, and Jackson is running, and he does pretty well in that election. As you can see, he gets 76% of the electoral vote. So he is still popular in much of the country. But then he has the Bank War, and the Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816, but Jackson was never a big fan of it. And it was a depository for federal funds and paid national debts, but was only answerable to its directors and stockholders and not to the electorate. So that was a sort of thorn in the side. The head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, sort of got into a bank war with Andrew Jackson, who distrusted the bank and had lost some money in speculation. There was an argument over hard money versus soft money. Soft money is paper currency, and a lot of people often like to have that because it's easier to print more of and you can get it and it's cheap, versus this idea of hard money, which is a gold or silver standard. Jackson wanted soft money because it provided easier credit for land speculators out west. Biddle was not a big fan of that. The Bank War, Jackson was outspoken about the bank, and he vetoed the renewal of the charter. He also ordered the removal of money and wanted it placed in friendly banks, not, banks that were led by friends of Andrew Jackson, basically. So you can see that cartoons at the time are reflecting this bank war. Here you have doctors are puzzled by the desperate case of Mother Bank, what to do with her. She's very ill. They're thinking about it. So you have the removal of federal deposits ordered by Andrew Jackson from the Second Bank of the United States and placed in friendly banks. He used his executive power to do that. The bank board was made up of wealthy manufacturers, and they viewed this as a bias against manufacturing. And it caused growing resentment towards the bank because it was viewed that these manufacturers were not funding westward expansion. So you sort of have an argument between the haves and the have-nots in the United States. Manufacturers, wealthy merchants, versus the common man, the farmer, that sort of thing. So the charter is left to expire and never is renewed. So then you have the first of the anti-Jackson sentiments. Some here he is slaying the many-headed monster. Here he is called King Andrew. And so he is not being painted in a very likable fashion. In the election of 1836, you can see at this point the Democrats are not as successful. The Whigs are actually gaining ground, and in fact there are 3 Whig candidates at this point. So you have Martin Van Buren, who actually does win, but he's basically a puppet for Jackson and serves as a Jackson surrogate. And he ultimately ends up getting blamed for one of the sort of crises of the Jackson administration, which was the Jackson Executive Order of Specie Circular, because Van Buren actually ends up enforcing it. So here you have Western land sales. You can see during Jackson's administration they spike up. And Martin Van Buren actually goes to enforce this Jackson executive order, which said that the payment for government land would be in gold or silver. So this causes inflation, and people become pretty angry about that, and results in another panic in 1837. Then you have the election in 1840 of William Henry Harrison. They held a convention to determine a candidate within their own party and then run him. He's an anti-Van Buren and anti-Jacksonian. He ran on the campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which Tippecanoe was a battle during the War of 1812. This is the campaign that is run by the Democrats, the Hard Cider and Log Cabin campaign. Harrison was too old to run. They called him Granny. You can see he's kind of elderly looking in this image. So again, this is you're starting to see the beginnings of modern campaigning here. And a campaign poster. Another campaign poster from the time. And Harrison actually wins, winning 80% of the vote versus Van Buren winning 20% of the vote. So that's a landslide. We know he only stayed in office for like 41 days because he gave an inaugural address and then got pneumonia. So he is then succeeded by John Tyler. And then John Tyler is reelected in 1840. And that is the presidency of Andrew Jackson and the guys that followed. The mediocre presidents, some would say. All right, that's it. Have a nice day. Bye.